And we are live. Welcome back, everybody, to the Revo Report. Have you ever watched someone build an elaborate argument while systematically removing its foundation? That's what we're witnessing in this exchange. Our atheist friend claims human flourishing as life's purpose while simultaneously removing the very ground that gives such concepts meaning. It's kind of like watching someone saw off the branch they're sitting on. Philosophically fascinating, but existentially perilous. Welcome to the Revo Report. We're inspiring faith with reason and reason with faith. Now, before we dive deeper, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. These aren't just academic debates. They strike at the heart of how we live, love, and find meaning in a universe that offers no easy answers. Let's dive right into it.
Question. I just didn't think it was relevant to the conversation. I believe in flourishing, in human flourishing, and eudaimonia. I believe that we have goodness in our lives, that there are good things to experience, good things to learn and be. I mean, there is an inherent goodness to human life that has no relationship with anything higher than humanity. And once you acknowledge that there's something higher than humanity, it belittles us. I specifically, just so I don't get off topic, that what I live for is flourishing.
Who defines flourishing?
I do, for myself.
Fine. And the KKK defines flourishing for themselves.
That's fine.
It's
That doesn't
fine.
mean they're right.
And the terrorists who bombed and shot people in Paris define flourishing for themselves.
Yeah, but now you're making, so you asked what I live for. You did not say, do I believe in some sort of absolute good?
I did not. I asked you, how do you define flourishing? Who defines flourishing?
We each define flourishing.
Okay. Now, if you think about it, you're going to realize you've thought it one way, defined flourishing one way.
That's fine.
The terrorists have obviously defined it another way.
Fine.
Nobody's right, nobody's wrong, it's all relative.
I'm not talking about ethics. That's why I said this was outside of the realm of the conversation.
Now, he keeps saying that's fine. But the truth is, that's not fine. It's not fine that people kill babies. It's not fine that people bomb themselves thinking they're going to go to heaven. It's not fine that there's terrorism. Those things are not fine. So from an atheistic perspective, you have to be able to justify or at least defend your stance and not just say, well, that's fine. That's fine that my worldview cannot somehow explain these things. All right, let's continue.
Flourishing does not include ethics?
Excuse me?
Flourishing does not include ethics?
You asked what I live for.
Yeah, flourishing, you said.
Yeah, that's not an ethical statement. That's a
Does that
psychological
include
statement.
ethics? To flourish as a human being, does that include understanding what's good? I thought you used the word goodness.
It includes goodness. It doesn't understand it does not include the understanding of goodness.
It includes good, but not the understanding of goodness.
My moral imperative is
the language is
flourish.
breaking down.
No, my moral imperative is to flourish. My moral imperative is not. It does not include having some sort of ultimate goodness. I don't have that claim on reality. I just said earlier in my honest question, one that I've asked of priests in the past when I was really questioning. My honest question is faith compatible with this idea? That's a very specific question. Okay.
With flourishing?
With the fact that my logic is limited. I could be wrong. I know that I could be wrong. When you take that same idea and apply it to flourishing, yes, I am going to do my utmost to be a good person, but that does not mean that I know what good is. I don't lay any sort of claim to absolute goodness.
Like it or not, you have to make a judgment call on what the terrorists did in Paris.
Yeah.
They define that as flourishing, as their goodness. Mm-hmm. Now, you just can't live in a vacuum and say, well, it really doesn't matter, it's irrelevant. You have to make a judgment call. Is that right or wrong? You have to make a judgment call. Is the KKK right or wrong in denigrating black people and elevating Aryan supremacy? You can't just live in a vacuum and say, well, it's irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. It's real life. So who defines flourishing? And if you define it, then what makes your definition right and the KKK or the terrorist definition wrong?
Exactly.
Our disagreement isn't about what flourishing is. Our disagreement seems to be that you think that there has to be this objective rule, and if I'm not following that, you even specifically said it earlier, that's why I stood up. You accused anyone who does not have an absolute idea of ethics as being a relativist. You're accusing me of being a relativist and saying that I believe this and someone else believes that, and that we're both right in our own spheres. And there are other ethical views besides absolutism and relativism. Like you can't set up this false dichotomy and say either I'm making some sort of absolute claim or what I'm saying is useless. That's just totally unfair and doesn't match our human experience. So, I mean,
It matches my experience totally, as it does Camus, Sartre, and Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, and all the great atheistic thinkers who had the intellectual honesty to acknowledge if there is no God, there is no mind prior to the human mind, which means it's obviously the human mind that defines justice and injustice, what it means to flourish or not flourish, what it means to live a good life or not to live a good life. It's all the creation of the human mind. It's a human fantasy. My fantasy is not superior to your fantasy. Your fantasy is not superior to my fantasy. It's all relative. And I'm saying, sir, I don't think you can live that way. I think
agree.
I could be wrong.
He just said, I agree. And this is what the illusion of self-defined goodness is. When you say something like, I believe in flourishing, I define flourishing for myself. Well, when an atheist states that, you basically have reasoning. You've just entered a logical fallacy. When pressed on who determines what constitutes flourishing, what does he do? He retreats to pure subjectivity. I do for myself. And then he says, well, it's not relative. So it's just, you're breaking down the foundations of even logic. You know, when you destroy the seedbed of truth, you cannot sustain the flowers of virtue. A self-defined morality is ultimately no morality at all. It's preference masquerading as principle. And this isn't just theoretical. Studies from Harvard's moral psychology lab demonstrates that people across all cultures intuitively reject moral relativism in practice. Now, in theory, it sounds great. It sounds ideal. But when researchers presented scenarios involving harmful acts committed by people from cultures with different moral norms, participants reliably judged harmful acts as wrong, regardless of cultural context, revealing your innate, my innate, all of our innate recognition of transcendent moral truths. And the Bible illuminates this tension so well in Judges 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And what was the result of this? Societal breakdown, injustice, and suffering. Self-defined goodness inevitably collapses under its own weight. Now, if this conversation is challenging your thinking, hit that like button and share it with someone who's wrestling with life's biggest questions. These explorations matter far more than the latest trending distractions. They shape our culture. They shape our schools. They shape our societies. And when this atheist makes a remarkable claim of there is an inherent goodness to human life that has no relationship with anything higher than humanity, well, we can look at this philosophical sleight of hand and examine it. It was G.K. Chesterton who exposed this very contradiction. He said this: the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. You see, goodness severed from its source becomes either arbitrary or illusory. It's just an illusion. Now, historically, the 20th century provides a sobering laboratory experiment. When societies attempted to establish ethics without transcendence, whether in communist regimes or fascist states, the result was catastrophic moral collapse. As documented by historians like Elaine Besancon, these systems maintained moral language while emptying it of metaphysical content, resulting in unparalleled atrocities justified as, well, flourishing. And it was these atheistic communist regimes that killed off more people than any other regime in mankind. Romans 2:14-15 explains this brilliantly. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. You see, we recognize goodness precisely because the lawgiver has inscribed it within us. God has created that in us because we are imago Dei, created in his image, the image of God. And I'm curious about your perspective here. Drop a comment sharing how you ground concepts like goodness and flourishing. Whether you believe in what I believe or what Cliff believes or this atheist believes or not, let us know. Your voice matters in this dialogue. And this community grows richer through our collective wrestling with these essential questions. But there is a false dichotomy, isn't there? Faith versus reason in human purpose. And when cornered by examples of flourishing, for example, terrorists, KKK, indigenous groups who think burning their babies is still beneficial to get more rain, to help out with their crops, this atheist protests, you're accusing me of being a relativist. And he says this, he says, there are other ethical views besides absolutism and relativism. Yet, he is unable to articulate what this middle ground might be. And I would argue he will never be able to articulate it because it contradicts itself. It was Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician and Christian philosopher, who understood this very well. The heart has its reasons, which reason know nothing of. You see, faith doesn't abandon reason, it completes it. Addressing the questions reason alone cannot and will never be able to answer. And that's why in this channel, we talk about faith with reason and reasoning with faith. Neuroscience increasingly confirms this very integration. So research from the University of Oxford's Center for Neuroethics reveals that moral reasoning activates both analytical brain regions and emotional processing centers. So the right brain and the left brain. You see, human beings are hardwired for moral reasoning that transcends pure rationality or mere sentiment. Precisely what we'd expect if created in the image of a rational, loving God. Proverbs 9:10 puts it succinctly. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We know also that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Not the end of wisdom, but the very beginning. You see, faith provides the foundation from which reason can properly function. And what's particularly compelling in this exchange is how the atheist keeps circling back to the question of, can faith be compatible with human flourishing? His instinct is correct. There's a profound hole in his worldview that he senses but can't quite name. And there is an ultimate question that you and I and all of us will have to ask. Is it groundless goodness or divine design? You see, friend, what we're witnessing isn't just philosophical sparring. It is the human soul crying out for coherence. When our atheist friend here says acknowledging something higher belittles us, he reveals modern humanity's core anxiety, that God's existence threatens our autonomy rather than completes our design. We're going back to the Garden of Eden. We're going back to questioning God. Is God really good? Does God really want us to have knowledge? Does God really have the best interest for us? It's the ultimate snake. C.S. Lewis, who walked the path from atheism to faith, discovered the opposite truth. He said this, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. God doesn't diminish humanity. He defines and elevates it. You see, without God, concepts like flourishing, goodness, meaning are sophisticated fictions, useful perhaps, but ultimately groundless. With God, they become revelations of reality's deepest structure. And Jesus didn't come to impose arbitrary rules on human flourishing. He came to restore it, declaring, I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. John 10:10. His death shattered sin's power. His resurrection secured our redemption. His return promises cosmic restoration. He transforms your confusion into clarity, your brokenness into beauty, your questioning into questing, your emptiness into abundance. The question isn't whether you can flourish without God. The question is why you would want to when the author of Flourishing stands at your heart's door knocking, ready to show you what eudaimonia truly means, not as a philosophical concept, but as a living reality. The question is, will you answer?